is Duke University.
This is Office Hours at Duke University. Today, marine biologist Ari Friedlaender takes your questions about life in Antarctica. Friedlaender is an assistant research scientist of marine science and conservation in Duke's Nicholas School of the Environment. He is based at the Duke Marine Lab in Beaufort, North Carolina. In addition to scientific work, he is also a professional photographer. Friedlaender is recently back from an expedition in Antarctica, where he studies whales, seals, penguins, and other large marine predators. His work there presents him with majestic settings and elegant animals, as well as nasty storms and very cold weather. To ask Friedlaender a question, send an email to live@duke.edu. Tweet with the tag Duke Live, or post to the Duke University Facebook page. You can watch today's discussion again anytime on Duke On Demand.
Thanks for tuning into Office Hours. I'm Ashley Yeager, a science reporter in the Office of News and Communications. Joining me today is marine biologist Ari Friedlaender. Ari, you study humpback whales. Why whales, and particularly why whales in Antarctica?
It's a great question, Ashley, and aside from whales just being an extremely interesting group of animals to work with, they also represent things in the marine ecosystem that allow us to understand what's happening in bigger areas or different places. So things we can learn about whales can cascade down to how the entire ecosystem is functioning. And the Antarctic is a great place because it's undergoing a lot of climate change right now at a rate that's not nearly as slow as other places on the planet. So if we can learn about one system that's reacting very quickly to climate change, it might give us some insights into how other systems work.
Could you give us an example of one of the observations that you're seeing?
Yeah, certainly. So we work around the Antarctic Peninsula, which is the peninsula of land that sticks north-south and is just below South America. And the climate there in the last 50 years has changed dramatically. So in the wintertime, temperatures are about 6 degrees Celsius warmer than they had been, and that results in a lot less sea ice. And sea ice is a feature of that environment that all the animals that live there have adapted to. So the most glaring change, aside from the actual temperatures, is the amount of sea ice that you see there.
Okay. And so you mentioned climate change and these changes that are happening in the sea ice. Mm-hmm. Is that related to things that we're doing, that humans are doing?
Yeah, unfortunately it is. And it's really well known that climate goes through cycles over long periods of time. And what's happening now is that the rate of change in these ecosystems it's much more dramatic than it would have been if humans weren't producing waste from fossil fuels and putting other chemicals into the environment. So we're definitely seeing an acceleration of trends that may have been natural, but the rate that we're changing them is clearly a result of what we're doing to the environment.
Okay. And so along that lines, we have a question from one of our viewers. Her name's Babs from Arizona. And she said, do you think that Antarctica will likely ever be populated as a settlement, or will it always remain a last frontier? And how much has the tourist industry increased since you first started going there?
Those are great questions. Right now, Antarctica as a continent is governed by an international organization of countries that get together, and the way that people are able to live on Antarctica right now is strictly science-based. So the treaties that govern Antarctica don't allow for any politics, don't allow for any defense mechanisms or anything of that nature. It's a peaceful, strictly scientific community that's there, and I would anticipate that would sort of foster itself over time, and that policy gets renewed every 40 years or so. So hopefully it's not something that would ever change quickly. Okay. Now with the tourist industry, it certainly has grown quite a bit. It's I want to say the late 60s, early 70s is when the tourist industry started there, and from a handful of people going now to several tens of thousands of people that go each year, it's growing. But it too is very well regulated by an organization that makes sure that there's only X number of people that are going down and are only going to very specific sites where the impact might be greater in sort of small areas, but overall is trying to minimize the impact that humans have in that system.
Okay, that ties actually into another question from one of our viewers, LK from Connecticut. He asks, has the ozone layer continued to be affected by the increase of Antarctic tourism?
The ozone layer, I don't think has. I think the changes in the ozone layer were due to persistent chemicals that were sort of have been deposited in the atmosphere over longer periods of time. So the actual movement of people back and forth doesn't affect the ozone layer in the Antarctic. But it certainly is something that even people that live in southern South America have to deal with. They've got indexes of danger, in summertime when they're down there, and it'll say the ozone index today is X amount. Don't spend time outside from this hour to this hour. So it's a real thing for the people that live at least close to Antarctica, and certainly the animals that live in the Antarctic where that hole is don't have the option of moving. But it's not something that the tourist industry really contributes to.
Okay. And so we've been talking about Antarctica, and you're actually a photographer. You take some images of your trips when you go. Mm. And so maybe we can take a look at some of these images, and you can talk a little bit about what you're trying to achieve with them. What's your goal in documenting, both scientifically sure. and also if you have any other goals with the images?
Yeah, absolutely. As a photographer, I definitely do. And Antarctica is a really difficult place to try and explain to somebody who hasn't been there before. And so one of the things I try to do with photographs is bring back images that can evoke some kind of an emotion. Mm-hmm. That it might be something that you've seen before, but it might be slightly different. The species that you see might be a little different than what you've seen before. But the thing you really can't capture is the scale and the coldness of the environment. So I try and focus on things that are either images in time of animals, like this humpback whale that's breaching right there, and you can see a glacier behind it, and that's not the sort of thing you'd see in every part of the world.
Right.
I love this picture. This was a really intense storm that we had this past May when we were down there. I think we had winds that were blowing up to about 80 miles an hour, and just blowing snow off an iceberg like that. Well, like I said, it doesn't capture the real sense of cold, but it gives you some idea of sort of the contrast or the starkness of the landscape, and I think people connect with that if they can have some sort of an emotion that comes out of what they're seeing. And so for me, if you can't show everybody or tell everybody the science, you can at least introduce them to some of the things that live down there.
Okay, great. So here's an interesting question from Linda. I read that on a recent voyage in Antarctica, while you were out in a zodiac, a penguin jumped into the zodiac, hitting you in the chest.
All right.
What a shock that must have been. Are penguins aggressive, or was it being chased by something, or was this just a random act?
That's a great question. First off, penguins are amazing animals. The adaptations they have for living in this part of the world are phenomenal. If you get to learn about their life history or how they're able to cope with cold down there, they're certainly not aggressive towards people. They're actually much more curious than anything else. If you go to a rookery, the chicks are always looking for food, and if you've got a shoelace hanging down or something that looks like food to them, they're very liable to come up and maybe try and eat it. They can be quite aggressive to each other because on land they breed in colonies and space is limited, so everybody's got their little parcel of land, and if you kind of walk through and get a little too close, someone sitting on a nest or a penguin sitting on a nest might kind of come after you. The case that this person was talking about was kind of funny. We were following a whale that we had placed a tag on, and we were basically sitting still, and we saw this penguin kind of swimming around. It was a Gentoo penguin, and we also noticed a leopard seal, which is one of the penguin's predators in the area. And we were literally just kind of like sitting there like, oh, look, the penguin's swimming around in the water, that's cool. And then all of a sudden it started speeding up and getting, kind of erratic, and next thing I know, it was kind of coming at me, and it literally just kind of jumped out of the water trying to land on our Zodiac. It kind of hit me in the stomach and bounced off the pontoon and back in the water, and we were all just like, did that really happen? And then it jumped out of the water again and went kind of right past me and landed on a little piece of ice next to us, and it was clearly just trying to get out of the water where it had a better chance of surviving the leopard seal.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. And so we talked about images and some of these experiences that you've had. What other tools do you use to study whales?
That's a great question. We use photography quite a bit. Each animal, the flukes, the tail, the underside of it has pigment and sort of scarring patterns that are unique for the individual. Mm-hmm. So we take pictures of the animals that we see, and we compare those with scientists in other parts of the world. And one of the recent things that we found was an animal that we observed in the Antarctic Peninsula actually breeds in American Samoa, which is about 10,000 kilometers away from its feeding grounds. And we typically thought these animals made much shorter migrations to South America, but this shows that these animals have a much greater range than we thought beforehand. And so that's sort of a very passive way to study them. The other thing that we do down there is we put small tags on these whales for about 24 hours at a time, and they apply to the back of the whale with a suction cup. And they've got a bunch of sensors that help us understand what the whales are doing underwater. And if we measure other features of the water column or the distribution of their prey, we can get a much better idea about how these whales are eating, how much they're eating, and the things that they need in their environment to sustain them.
I think we actually have a video of you and your colleagues tagging a whale. Maybe we could take a look at that and just get a sense of what goes on.
Sure. So this is a pretty unique situation. This is a humpback whale that's literally sleeping at the surface, and this is my colleague Dave Johnston putting a tag on. So this is a carbon fiber pole he's got, and the tag is at the very end of it there, and we're literally paddling up in our Zodiac. You'll hear the tag go on right there. Those are the suction cups. And you notice the whale didn't even wake up when you put the tag on, which is remarkable. It only kind of woke up when the Zodiac got into its field of view there, and then it woke up and it took a breath. You can see the tag on the whale right there, and then about 2 minutes later the whale was back sleeping. So that's as controlled a situation as we can have when we go up and put a tag on a whale. But you could see that it was a pretty non-invasive, sort of minimal response from the animal, and that's the thing that we want to do, is we want to put something on the animal that's not going to affect its natural behavior. So this tag that we use is a good example of that.
Okay. And so talking about using this data that you're collecting, we have a question from Jennifer. She asks, how long does it take to have a baby whale, and how much krill does a whale eat in a year? So I think the tags help with that in some way.
Yeah, the tags do. The first question, the tags don't necessarily help with. We know that whale gestation or pregnancy is about a year. The humpback whales that we're studying, they're about 45 feet long, and the calves that they have when they give birth to them are still 15 or 16 feet long. So they're enormous when they're born, but when you're born into the water, you can't be like a human infant that needs to be held and needs to be cuddled. You need to be able to swim and do everything on your own as soon as you're born. So they develop a little more inside of mom so that when they come out, they're fully functioning. And that's sort of unique to the marine environment. So a full year is what it takes for that whale to gestate. In terms of how much a whale eats in a day, it's a fantastic question, and it's a simple question in theory, but when you can't see what a whale is doing below the surface, it makes it really difficult. And so some of the work we're doing now is to try and put these tags on whales that can hopefully tell us when and where they're feeding in the water column. And if we can also measure where the prey is and how dense it is where the whales are feeding, we can then do some math and figure out, okay, if it took X number of mouthfuls and the krill density was this much over a day, it ate this much. And what we want to do is try and tag a whole lot of animals because there's a lot of variability. A mom that's pregnant is going to have a much greater energetic need than maybe an older animal that's not reproducing, or a younger animal might have different needs as well. So we want to try and collect a sample of all the different life history classes, from juveniles to adults, to try and figure out what exactly they're eating or how much they're eating.
So do you have a figure of how much a single whale, let's say a male whale, could eat in a day?
We can estimate that right now, like maybe a humpback whale that's sort of an adult male or an adult animal probably eats between 400 and 600 kilograms of krill per day. But it only does this in a sort of a contracted feeding season, because that animal then is going to leave the feeding grounds and migrate to a breeding ground. So it's only eating for one portion of the year, because when it's either in transit or up on these breeding grounds, it's not eating. So it needs to eat everything it can in 1 year and store that energy as fat, basically, just to keep it going for the rest of the year.
Interesting. Okay. And so you mentioned that obviously you can't see what the whales are doing under the water. Mm-hmm. So with the radio sensor, then you can follow them. And I think we actually have an animation of some of the data you've taken. Maybe we can watch that, and you can talk us through what we're seeing in this animation, how you use that data to understand the whale's behavior better.
Yeah, absolutely. What's really cool, so this is a whale. This is an animation of a whale with a tag on it, and the white line represents the track of the whale. You'll see it's coming to the surface right now. It's taking a few breaths. It's going down on a dive. And where you see these sort of these big U's or these dips in the dive pattern is actually where the whale's feeding or taking lunges underwater. You can see the animal's sort of at the surface right now traveling along, and it's going to make a dive here. So right there is a feeding event, right there is a feeding event. And what you see in the background is the boat that we typically use, and we use what are called echo sounders. And they basically are like a fish finder or a depth finder that send out an acoustic signal in the water, and it bounces off of anything in the water column. And we use that to estimate how dense the prey is. So if we map the prey all around, you can see that red track was the track of our ship, the white track was the whale, and if we measure the prey exactly where the whale is feeding, we can sort of figure out how much that animal is eating. And so these visualizations are great for me and for us as scientists, because it gives us a good perspective of the space that the animal's using, the depth that they're going, and when they're feeding. And it's also a great educational tool. We use these kinds of things in classes. My nephew is in Philadelphia listening, right now, and I'll show that to their class of, 8 and 9-year-olds, but we can also show that to a class of undergraduates here at Duke or graduate students and give them an idea of what the whale is doing underwater.
So here's a question. I mean, you might have answered this, but maybe we can talk about a little bit more about it in depth. What do humpback whales eat, and why do we care about that?
It's a great question. So humpback whales are really interesting because we find them in the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, and the Antarctic, and all over. And in each of those systems, they eat different food. So in the Antarctic, they eat krill, which is a small shrimp-like critter that's about the size of your pinky nail, or your pinky, not your nail. In the Atlantic, they eat herring and sand lance. In the Pacific, they eat herring and krill. And they're, as a top predator, they take quite a bit of food out of the ecosystem, but what they feed on is also the things that are the most abundant. So by learning about what these whales require and how much impact they have on that system, we learn about the health of that ecosystem and any of the impacts that human influence might have on it.
Okay. And so we actually have a question from a class. This is from Megan's marine science class. And they ask, what are the effects of climate change on whale migration patterns?
It's a really good question. The short answer is we don't know right now, but we're starting to see some evidence of how climate change is manifesting itself in the Antarctic. So when we go down in April and May and even into June, that's a time of year that typically animals that are migrating to a breeding ground would have left already. But in the Antarctic, when I mentioned there's that lack of sea ice now, the areas that the whales were feeding in typically would have been covered by ice in previous years, and it's not covered by ice anymore. So the physical features that would have pushed those whales out aren't there anymore. So if a whale isn't going to be breeding, not all whales breed every year. If a female gives birth in 1 year, she's going to have that calf for 1 year. She's going to gestate for another year, so it might be 3 or 4 years before she gives birth again. So she doesn't need to make that migration, but she is going to be physically forced out of an area if it gets covered by ice. So if it's not getting covered by ice as much, the prey is still there and might be more available for the whales for a longer period of time. And that could have serious consequences for the other animals that might rely on that prey resource. So that's sort of what we're leaning towards right now in our understanding of how places like the Antarctic are changing with climate and how that might affect their migration. Now, the converse would be if it affects their breeding grounds. And we think that the breeding grounds have to be very specific places that fall within a temperature range, are close to shore, and have some protection. And as climate change occurs, basically the tropical areas in the country, around the world, are going to move towards the north and the south. So it might be that breeding grounds end up being more north or more south, which means that they might actually get closer to the feeding grounds. So the migratory route that the animals take actually might get shorter, which means they have to spend less time migrating so they can spend more time feeding. And you can see how it could be this kind of snowballing effect of spending more time on your feeding ground, and the processes that allow the prey to exist are typically tied to light levels and productivity as well. And if those aren't changing, but the whales are spending more time on the feeding ground, you never know what's going to happen. So that's all sort of speculation at this point, but it's something that we're starting to see inklings of.
So with that speculation and then taking into account human activity, what's going on, there's civil unrest in Egypt, and the economy situation in our own country is a challenge. Why should we look to protect this environment of the whales and the Adelie and Gentoo penguins?
That's a great question, and it's not an uncommon question, and it'd be difficult to ever say that, putting the needs of humans above animals or these ecosystems is wrong. But at the same time, I think people learn so much from and have such an appreciation for nature and natural systems that it really behooves us to have them available to us, not only to study, but to appreciate. And also the things that we rely on, most of the food resources that we rely on come from the ocean. It's a massive resource that we exploit right now. And as global populations increase, we're going to rely more and more on resources from the ocean, because places on land are probably going to not be able to sustain the amount of nutrition or be able to produce the amount of nutrition that we need. So ocean ecosystems and having them function and be sustainable is incredibly important to human survival as well.
So in terms of that, what steps could we take to make the ocean ecosystems more sustainable?
Those are they're tricky questions, because as we get more and more people on the planet, there's more and more food that we need. And so it really comes down to being able to manage ways that we extract things and do it in sustainable ways. And so not taking out every fish in a population at once, and not fishing one species completely down. And it might mean fishing different areas at different times of the years, and trying to manage how much we take out at once. And it's definitely a difficult prospect. And even in the Antarctic, krill is a very abundant resource that all the animals down there rely on. But there may come a time when humans are going to be competing for that resource too. As other fisheries dry up or need time to replenish themselves, it may be that Antarctic krill becomes something that humans start to take in greater numbers, and we're going to have to deal with that and come up with ways to manage the resource, not only for human consumption, but so that there's enough for everything in that ecosystem to be able to make it as well.
Okay. So I want to back up a little bit and talk about your adventures or expeditions down to Antarctica, and maybe just answer some basic questions about being down there. We have a question from Mollusk Mafia. How chilly is the water down there?
It's not chilly, it's freezing. When we go down to the Antarctic, when we go down in the Antarctic summertime, which would be December, January, the water is about 36 degrees Fahrenheit. And when we go down in April and May, it's down around 32, 31 degrees. So the seawater freezes a little below freezing where freshwater would freeze. It never gets warm down there. And if you end up in the water, you definitely know it's pretty chilly. Yeah.
Have you ever ended up in the water?
Yeah, as the first time you go down there, there's some social pressure to do things like that, and so everybody ends up jumping in the water at some point.
Okay.
It's pretty cool, and some people get used to it, and people that spend time at stations will take swims every once in a while.
Wow.
All the Scandinavian tourists that we go down with have this fascination with going in cold water and then getting into a sauna or a hot tub afterwards. So if you're not prepared for it, it can be shocking, but if you're prepared for it, it's just cold.
So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that tourism aspect that you mentioned. How are you affiliated with that?
In a couple of ways. As a scientist, we go down on dedicated cruises where we've got research questions and objectives, and that's basically all we're doing. And then when we come back, we basically talk to our science friends about that. And there's a real sort of gap in our transferring our knowledge from science to the public. And one of the great ways that you can do that is to actually engage people and put them in that situation and teach them or tell them about what exactly you're doing. So myself and my colleague Dave Johnston, who's at the lab as well, have gone down on some of these basically tourist ships to lecture about the natural history and climate change to the people and basically show them around and say, okay, we talked about Adelie penguins yesterday. Here's 10,000 Adelie penguins. And when we were talking about the climate change impacts on them, here's how you can see that manifesting itself. So aside from it being a great way for me to get back down there, I think it's a really important and valuable way to engage people and make them have a real connection with the place. And then when they come home, they're going to show all their friends those photos. And they're going to have a much greater appreciation for the place and probably a desire to do something to either change their lifestyle or to do something to try and protect that system. And that's that's why we do the science, is to understand it so we can protect it. And so I've found it to be a really valuable thing to do.
So when you take these tours down, do you ever get people who are skeptical about climate change?
Yeah, interestingly enough, we do. And honestly, I think if you're ever going to have somebody that doesn't really believe in climate change, the best thing that they can do is go down to a place like the Antarctic Peninsula, where you can engage them and say, well, what are your concerns? What are the things that you read that you don't believe, or that you're skeptical about? And then you can really pretty easily show them. You know, you don't have to sit down and always have a conversation. You can see, like, you know what, well, let's talk about this glacier. You know, over the last 40 years, this glacier has retreated by X amount. Or this population of penguins 10 years ago was 2,000 animals, now it's 100 animals. You know, and you can actually show the effects of climate change or climate-driven changes, and how accelerating those changes has impacted animals that are adapted for life down there and really can't cope with changes when they occur very quickly.
Could you give us an example that you might give one of these people about the whales that you study?
You know, a better example would probably be Adelie penguins. Whales have a nice buffer because they're so big and they live so long, and they're so mobile as well. They can sort of, they're not resistant to these changes, but you don't see them occurring as quickly. But something like a penguin, like an Adelie penguin, that it grows relatively quickly. They breed every year once they reach maturity, and they have very sort of strict rules that they follow when they breed, and requirements for being able to successfully breed. And so a thing like an Adelie penguin that can only eat krill, and when it's provisioning a chick, it can only go so far from the rookery before it has to come back and feed that chick. And it can only build its nest on a particular type of rock, you know, and it can't really cope with a lot of snowfall. It can't cope with prey being far away from it. And then in the wintertime, those animals go very far off to sea. So if there's less sea ice, there's going to be more precipitation. It's going to make it harder for those animals to build their nests. And krill have a very tightly coupled life history with sea ice. And so if there's less krill around and available for those penguins, they can't go far enough to find enough food to provision a chick. So they're going to abandon a colony, and you're going to see over time the numbers of that colony dwindle pretty quickly. And that story has been told, and it's been published in a couple of great books and popular articles. And Adelie penguins down there are sort of really the bellwether right now. I think the name of the book is Bellwether for Climate Change. That Adelie penguins are really sort of the face of that right now.
Speaking of penguins, how does that situation mirror or relate to March of the Penguins, the kind of famous or popular movie that came out about penguins?
Emperor penguins are not unlike Adelie penguins. Those are the only two species that actually have some of their, well, for emperor penguins, they only breed on sea ice in the Antarctic, around the peninsula. Penguins are only found in the Southern Ocean, but some of them breed in places like the Falkland Islands or subantarctic islands. But emperor penguins only breed on sea ice on the continent. And so as things warm up, the likelihood for those animals to have a place to breed diminishes. But then the amount of area that they've got to go to find the food resources that they need increases. And if you saw the movie, the trek that those animals have to make is phenomenal. And any change to that or perturbation to that is really going to affect their ability to raise an offspring. So they're under the same types of pressures. Yeah.
Okay. So I want to get to some of the questions that we've had come in. Mm-hmm. Maybe the first one we can start and talk about you personally and your research. Lee asks, how did you start studying this? Were you interested in whales when you were a boy? And if a student is interested in studying this, what would you advise?
From my own experience, I grew up near the water. I was either in a stream or at the beach pretty much every day when I was a kid. So I knew early on that the ocean was something that interested me. And I think I got excited about whales when I was in middle school, and we did a class on whales and went on a whale watching trip. And after that, as a boy, I also liked sharks. And then you either see a lecture or a TV show. Jacques Cousteau was huge for me when I was a kid. And then when I got into college, I started taking more classes, and I actually came to the Duke Marine Lab when I was an undergrad and took a class on marine mammals. And that, it just clicked at that point. And I knew that was a group of animals I was really interested in studying. And then, honestly, I just happened to be in sort of the right place at the right time to go on a trip to the Antarctic in 1997. And about the second day I got on the boat, I knew, all right, this is a place I want to spend a lot of my a lot of time working. And I basically told the woman that was running the cruise that's what I was interested in. And I, you didn't take no for an answer, and you kept asking interesting questions, and eventually you get to the point where you can start actually making that happen. For students that are interested in it, it's never too early to be interested in this kind of stuff. And being persistent and asking good questions is really the key to it. Science is all about answering these questions, and if you've got an excitable mind and you're eager and you want to learn, you shouldn't let anything stop you from doing that.
So you mentioned something key when you were younger. You went out and went whale watching. Mm-hmm. What opportunities do people in the middle school to high school range have to do that?
It's a good question. If you're in the middle of the country, those are obviously going to be a little limited, and oceanariums and aquariums offer good educational opportunities. But on the coast, there's an increasing number of programs in middle schools and high schools to engage students and bring them out. I know at the Marine Lab in the summer we have summer programs for kids that are in middle school as well. And I'd encourage you to bug your teacher, and tell them what you're interested in and the things that are important to you. And it's a great educational experience. A lot of whale watching operations have naturalists on board, and you can learn an amazing amount by spending a couple hours on a boat with somebody who spends a lot of time with those animals. So I would honestly encourage you to kind of bug your teacher and say, this is what I'd like to do.
So we actually have a question from another marine science class. This is from Ashley's marine science class. How is ocean acidification affecting the Antarctic food chains and webs, and are you seeing any impacts?
It's a real good question. And broadly, acidification in the ocean is a huge deal because it's going to affect how much carbon the oceans can hold, and that's going to have a huge impact on sort of down the line how much our climate changes. I've got to be honest, I don't know a whole lot about how it's manifesting itself in the Antarctic. Certainly at the top predator level, like with penguins and whales and seals, we're not seeing the effects immediately. But honestly, I'm probably not the right person to be able to answer that in the Antarctic.
Okay. And so we have a question from Jeffrey. He asks, what is the connection between sonar use and whale health, and do you see any effects in Antarctica?
It's a real good question. Actually, off the coast of North Carolina, some colleagues in ours at the Marine Lab are doing some studies right now where we're trying to understand the response of whales to sonar. And there's two different questions. One is those echo sounders that we saw in the video. Those emit sound into the environment that's in the hearing range of some animals. We think it's pretty minor for those animals, and it's ubiquitous. There's tons and tons of boats that have those sorts of things. And so we're doing studies where we put that same tag, that suction cup tag on whales, because along with those sensors that it has on for movement underwater, it also has a microphone that records all the sound of the animal. And so if we play a sound and we know how loud the sound was when we played it, it'll get recorded on the tag, and we can look at how loud that sound was recorded on the tag, and we can look at whether or not that animal changes its behavior, and if it does, at what level of sound did the animal make that change. And we're really interested in that with things like naval sonar, things that are considered active sonar, that are very loud and broadcast over big areas. And there's been some cases where animals have ended up stranding on beaches in proximity to where operations have occurred where the Navy was using this type of sonar. So we're doing similar simulations where we put this tag on whales and play sound. What we do is we ramp the sound up. We start at a very low level and ramp it up to, it's still a relatively low level, but we look for behavioral responses in these animals. And it's really a factor for deep diving animals like beaked whales or sperm whales or pilot whales that go hundreds to thousands of meters deep. And for them, they use echolocation, just like a bat does. So they use sound, they make their own sonar. So they use sound to image their environment and to find prey. And what we're finding is that when you play these sort of sonar sounds to the animals, the way that they change their behavior is to stop feeding. So they stop making the sounds that help them feed, and typically they'll abort the dive that they're on and maybe go up to the surface and try and move away from that sound source. And there's a bit of a question or a debate as to whether the sound from sonar is actually creates physical trauma in the whales, or whether it's a behavioral response that the whales get scared and end up swimming too quickly to the surface and end up with some, with something wrong with them from surfacing too quickly, like you'd get if you were a diver and you got the bends. But there's no question that the animals respond behaviorally to these sounds. What we're trying to do is find out what level you have to play to these animals to get them to just begin to change their behavior. And then we can make recommendations to the people that use those sonars and say, look, if there's no whales around, great, you can do this. But if this type of whale or this type of whale is around, we know that they respond to sound at this level. So, maybe don't crank it up to 10, maybe, keep it down at 6 or 7. And that's a metric that we really want to be able to use, because if you don't have to harm these animals, and we can show that you don't have to, but you can still go about doing your business, that would be a win for everybody.
There was a 2008 U.S. Supreme Court case, I think, on the use of sonar related to marine mammals. Mm-hmm. Does a lot of this research that's coming out now relate to that kind of decision making? Yeah,
it absolutely does. And the people that fund that research are actually the Office of Naval Research and some of these agencies that do science as well as sort of some of these defense activities. And so we're working very closely with them on that. And so in one sense, it's good because they're funding research to try and address that question. And so they're being proactive in that sense. And we feel like they're asking the right people, and that we're doing the experiments in a controlled way, in a way that we can answer the question, and it'll be up to them to kind of decide whether or not they use that information.
So in terms of sonar, we talked about that kind of, I guess you could call it a type of pollution. Mm-hmm. But we have a question from Megan. She asked, despite being isolated, are you seeing the effects of pollution in Antarctica and the marine ecosystems there, and are you seeing it anywhere else?
It's a good question. One of the things that whales and more so toothed whales and dolphins that eat fish have going for them is that we know that they accumulate toxins from the environment. And there's this sort of a principle of bioaccumulation, that if you put something into the environment, the very basic things will accumulate it. The things that eat that will accumulate everything from the level below them. And when you get up the top of the food chain to things like marine mammals, you get a much larger concentration of those sorts of things. And even in North Carolina, Georgia, South Carolina, we've looked at, or colleagues have looked at, the amount of these pesticides and contaminants in bottlenose dolphins that live coastally, and the numbers are through the roof in some areas, especially in areas near river mouths where there's either large plants or large industrial complexes, and that the things that come out of those end up in the dolphins, and in extremely high levels, higher levels than you'd see in any kind of terrestrial animal. The Antarctic is good because we think it's the ecosystem basically contains itself in the Southern Ocean and in the waters around the Antarctic, and we think of that as being sort of a contained unit, and like the question said, very isolated. And so what we'd like to do is to take samples of blubber and the tissues that these contaminants would deposit themselves in marine mammals, and use the Antarctic as sort of a test case, and say if this is what we believe the baseline to be in a system that's removed from a lot of the pollution, how does that differ from an animal in a different part of the world? So right now, fingers crossed, we're not seeing those sorts of things. But the more we look, probably the more we're going to find, and certainly over time, there's a higher likelihood of that happening.
How do you take those samples of tissues?
We do biopsy sampling of skin and blubber. So the skin in these animals, in a humpback whale, is about 1 centimeter thick, about the thickness of a pencil eraser. And with a crossbow, we have a specially designed bolt that it almost looks like the cap of your pen. And there's a little flotation at the end of the bolts, and when you shoot the whale, it bounces out, and it takes a little plug of skin and blubber that's maybe 1 inch or 1.5 inches long. And we collect those samples and send them off to different labs. We've got some students down at the Marine Lab that are right now running our genetic samples. We've got colleagues in Wilmington who are looking at fatty acid composition and things like that. So from a very small sample that really doesn't affect the animal at all, we can learn a huge amount about the sex of the whale, the hormone levels in the whale, the contaminants. We can look at the levels in the food chain that the animals are foraging as well. So from a really small sample, we can address a whole lot of questions.
So in terms of, we talked a lot about whales and some about penguins. Maybe you could talk about some of the other animals in the polar regions, maybe seals, and just kind of elaborate on how they're being affected.
It's a great question. So seals, myself and a couple of colleagues are studying seals in the Arctic. And things like harp seals and hooded seals, basically what they do is they haul out on the ice that forms every year, and they give birth on that sea ice. They wean their pups, then they leave, and the pups basically sit on the ice to mature, and then eventually they go in the water and swim themselves. In the Arctic, the amount of sea ice annually that is occurring has been plummeting dramatically, and there's been a lot of papers published showing that both summer and winter sea ice concentrations are much lower. So if you have a substrate that these animals rely on to haul out on for resting and also giving birth, and you diminish that and take that away from them, those animals can't just go to land to give birth. So you remove literally the amount of habitat that they have to breed on, and that has a direct effect on the population's ability to survive. For things like polar bears, which have become a real icon for climate change, they rely on a type of seal that makes its den on that sea ice, and so they need large areas to be able to roam around on to find their food. And without that sea ice being present, the animals are spending more time in the water, they're having to go closer to land and moving to places that they traditionally don't go to and probably aren't well adapted to survive in. So some species of penguins are definitely taking it. Some species of seals are very much so in jeopardy. And even some whale populations that are in polar regions, their populations aren't on the same trajectory as other places in the world.
So when you're not in Antarctica or the Arctic, you're at the Marine Lab, and we have a question from Tom. He asks, tell us more about the Duke Marine Lab. Are there dorms there? Do the students spend a semester there or just a summer? Are there both undergraduate and graduate students? I guess he's kind of wondering what is the Duke Marine Lab?
Yeah, I love it. I mean, I first went there when I was an undergrad in 1994, and I moved down there in 2001 when I started my PhD, and I just haven't even left, so I really love it. It's great. It's on a small island. Beaufort is a really fantastic town in the summer. On the island itself, we do have dorms. We've got a number of dorms that undergraduates stay on through the year. So we bring in undergraduates for semesters at a time, both from Duke and from schools all around the country. During the summertime, we have a really broad program where we bring in not only college students from the U.S., but we have a global fellows program where we bring in international students, and we have courses on marine conservation and sea turtle biology and marine mammal biology. And in the summertime, we've got probably 100 or so students roaming around. We also have the TIP program comes and brings students there in the summer, so we've got middle school students there during the summer. Throughout the year, aside from the undergraduates who live on the island, there's also a master's program through the Nicholas School, and that's a marine environmental management program. And there's usually maybe 2 to 3 dozen master's students, and then we've got a really great population of PhD students that are at the lab as well. It's a few less than the master's. But we've got sort of every level of college education going on, and the classes are taught sometimes by students, mostly by the faculty, but they can engage undergraduates and graduate students as well. So there's opportunities in social sciences, in marine sciences, in sort of all across the board. If it involves a marine resource, there's courses at the Marine Lab for it.
So it sounds like you're not only a research scientist, but also, in a way, a teacher. We have a comment here from Ellen. It says, "Hi, Ari. You and Dave Johnston were such a splendid duo on our Antarctica trip with your superb lecturing and incredible patience in answering questions. A huge thank you. Duke students are fortunate to have you both on campus. Do you do formal teaching in the classroom?"
Yeah, we do. So Dave Johnston is teaching this afternoon, and we have a marine megafauna class that we teach on main campus here to try and engage undergraduates to the things that we do at the Marine Lab and that you can study in the oceans. And we use that as sort of a recruiting tool to try and get students to come down to the Marine Lab. At the Marine Lab, like I mentioned, we teach a marine mammals class. In the springtime, Dave and I are going to teach a course on climate change and marine mammals and try and get students to use programs to model how climate change might affect different populations of marine mammals. So you try and strike a balance because to me, doing the research is really what I enjoy doing. But the more I do it, the more I want to sort of continue to communicate it to people, and that's the most important thing we can do with the science. And so you have to find the balance between doing enough research to learn enough to be able to to teach, but not doing too much of one or too much of the other. But it's having opportunities to go on these cruises, teach at the Marine Lab, go to classrooms and other places is really nice. It's good to be diverse in the group of people that you're able to educate and to sort of show what you're doing, and that to me is the most fun for sure.
So I think we'll wrap up with two questions. Mm-hmm. The first being, if nothing changes environmentally, what's the future like for these animals that you study in Antarctica? And the second part being, what can we do to prevent that?
Yeah, that's sort of the $1,000,000 question. If things didn't change, if everything kind of went on hold right now, you'd probably see minor changes in species. And what you'd see is certain species do better than others, and you'd see some, the carrying capacity or the amount of animals that the ecosystem could hold would change for different species. And so, for instance, in the Antarctic, from 1900 to about 1986, about 2 million whales were taken out of that system through commercial whaling. So before 1900, the amount of whales that were there was very different than what we see now, and the amount of penguins and seals was very different. So what we see today, there may be a lot more penguins now and seals than there were 100 years ago when whale populations were higher. So what we're seeing now is what the system can hold, not necessarily what the system would be like outside of our influence on it. In terms of what people can do, it's a difficult question because I would have a lot of trouble asking or telling somebody to change their lifestyle and sacrifice things that are important in their life to make things better for a place that most people aren't even going to see. But we have to take care of the planet we live on. We're not just here for ourselves, but I think we have a responsibility to make sure that what we leave behind, certainly for our children and children's children, is a place that they can enjoy and that they're going to be able to thrive in. And for me, having wild places and wilderness and animals that you can study is the most important thing that I want to leave behind for people that come after me. So I'd have a real difficult time telling people what specifically to do differently, but to be conscious about the decisions they make, about how much they drive, what kind of car they drive, the things that they purchase, and think about if something has to be shipped from on a boat for 2 months to get to you, and then on a plane, and then on a truck. If it's something you can get locally, that the footprint of making that product didn't cause as much carbon pollution, maybe think about doing those things. But I try not to tell people what to do. I'm much better, I think, at telling people what I find exciting and what's exciting to me, and hopefully that's enough to get them excited about knowing that they need changes in humans to be able to survive, and then they can go on and do what they want.
Ari, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. Thanks for tuning in to Office Hours. Join us next week for a discussion about brands, marketing, and religion with Gavin Fitzsimmons of Fuqua's School of Business. You can find a recording of the talk on Duke On Demand.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.